Welcome to this explainer. Let's just jump right in, because today we are looking at a really pivotal moment in American history, but we're going to look at it through a completely different lens. We usually think of the end of Prohibition in 1933 as this inevitable cultural shift, right? Like society just collectively woke up and realized a moral crusade had failed. But the historical data tells a way more pragmatic and honestly a much more fascinating story. We're going to frame the end of Prohibition not as some great cultural awakening, but as a desperate, highly calculated, mechanical operation executed by the Roosevelt administration to basically save a collapsing economy.
To really understand why Prohibition ended, you have to wrap your head around one stark, devastating number: 60%. That represents the catastrophic plunge in federal income tax revenue between 1930 and 1933. Think about that. See, prior to 1913, the federal government relied heavily on alcohol taxes, sometimes making up to 40% of the entire budget. So when Prohibition started in 1920, the government became incredibly, dangerously dependent on the newly created income tax. And then, the 1929 stock market crash hits. Incomes evaporate overnight, and just like that, the government's main revenue stream dried up by 60%.
So what does this all mean? Well, this sheer economic desperation completely flipped the national narrative. This was no longer a debate over the morality of the local saloon. No, it became an absolute fiscal necessity. The government desperately needed revenue if it was going to put jobless Americans back to work and actually fund the massive recovery programs of the New Deal. Simply put, for the American economy to literally survive the Great Depression, Prohibition had to die.
So here's the agenda for our clinical autopsy today. We'll start with the economic necessity, then look at FDR's legislative maneuver, move into the unique ratification process, and finish up with the return to state control.
All right, let's dive into part one, the economic necessity, or basically a nation going broke.
Setting the scene in the early 1930s, the United States government is practically teetering on the edge of total financial collapse. The Great Depression was the absolute worst economic crisis in the industrialized world. That Black Thursday crash in 1929 didn't just wreck Wall Street. It wiped out everyday incomes for regular people. Bankruptcies were just snowballing everywhere, and because the federal government was so over-reliant on the income tax, it was suddenly totally starved for cash right when the public needed help the most. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the 1932 presidential election, FDR runs on a platform that explicitly promised to generate federal tax revenue and create jobs by legalizing the alcohol trade. When unemployment is skyrocketing, the promise of hundreds of millions of dollars in fresh tax revenue? That is an irresistible economic solution.
And the market's reaction to FDR's plan was absolutely explosive. We're talking about a staggering 365% market return on alcohol stocks just between February and August of 1933. Wall Street knew exactly what FDR's landslide victory meant. It meant an immediate, massive economic boom as a totally new, yet fully established industry was yanked out of the shadows and put right back onto the legal, taxable books.
Moving on to part two, FDR's legislative maneuvers and the search for a stopgap solution. Now, amending the Constitution is a notoriously slow process, right? But FDR needed a legislative stopgap to start generating tax revenue immediately to jumpstart the economy. That stopgap was the Collin-Harrison Act, also known as the Beer-Wine Revenue Act. Now, this didn't fully repeal Prohibition. Instead, it surgically amended the enforcement rules of the Volstead Act to legalize low-alcohol beer and light wine, specifically capped at 3.2% alcohol by weight. Signed into law on March 22, 1933, this wasn't about giving people the freedom to party, not at all. It was a calculated, brilliant move to create immediate manufacturing jobs and taxable commerce while the actual formal constitutional amendment was churning through the system.
But, for all that dry legislative maneuvering, FDR really knew how to play to the public. Shortly after taking office while hosting a dinner, he casually makes this famous remark: "I think this would be a good time for a beer." It just added the perfect touch of human humor to a really highly calculated political strategy. And on April 7th, the day the law took effect, which we actually now know as National Beer Day, Americans celebrated. The very first team of Budweiser Clydesdales even delivered a ceremonial case of beer straight to the White House.
Which brings us to part three, the unique ratification process and bypassing the politicians.
Okay, so getting a temporary bill passed is one thing, but permanently killing the 18th Amendment, that required some truly brilliant constitutional mechanics. Normally, to amend the Constitution, Congress sends the proposed amendment down to the state legislatures for ratification.
But the Roosevelt administration knew a secret. The Anti-Saloon League, the powerful lobby group that pushed prohibition in the first place, well, they still had an absolute iron grip on local statehouse politicians. So, to completely circumvent them, Congress used an alternative method outlined in Article 5 for the very first time in history: ratification by specially elected state conventions. This totally bypassed the entrenched local politicians and put the vote in the hands of specially appointed delegates, completely neutralizing the prohibition lobby. Pretty clever, right?
And just look at the speed of Prohibition's demise. It was rapid fire. In November 1932, FDR wins the election. By February 1933, Congress formally proposes the 21st Amendment. Just a month later, in March, that Stopgap Beer-Wine Revenue Act is passed to get the cash flowing. And by December 1933, the state conventions had moved with unprecedented speed to actually ratify the repeal. It goes to show, when fueled by severe economic desperation, political machinery can move at absolute lightning speed.
And that brings us to the ultimate kill shot, 36. Under the Constitution, 3/4 of the 48 states needed to approve the amendment. At exactly 3:32 p.m. local time on December 5, 1933, Utah cast the 36th and final state convention vote needed. With that single, historic vote, the 18th Amendment was completely erased, making it the first and literally still the only time in U.S. history that a constitutional amendment has been repealed.
Let's wrap up with Part 4, the return to state control and the fragmented system left behind.
So what did the landscape actually look like the very next morning on December 6th? We really need to evaluate the jurisdictional aftermath here, because it completely transformed enforcement. The 21st Amendment didn't just end the federal ban. It fundamentally shifted the entire balance of power. It explicitly barred the transportation of intoxicating liquors into any state in violation of that state's own laws. Overnight, regulatory power was completely stripped from federal prohibition agents and dropped right into the laps of state governors. And this sudden transfer of power? It created a wildly chaotic aftermath. Because states were now in charge, they could just decide to remain completely dry if they wanted to, or they could pass the buck and leave it up to individual towns and counties. This created a bizarre, totally fragmented patchwork of alcohol laws all across the country. In fact, Mississippi decided to maintain strict prohibition for another 3 decades, staying completely dry until 1966. And this legal fragmentation runs so deep that even today, 17 states actually have to explicitly forbid their local governments from establishing dry counties.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Next time you go to a local restaurant or grocery store, remember that the specific times you can buy a drink or even where you can buy it are entirely dictated by local laws. So how do the remnants of that 1933 jurisdictional shift back to state control still impact the unique commerce in your own town today? The end of Prohibition wasn't just a big party. It was a massive legal restructuring of American commerce that we are quite literally still navigating right now. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics behind the history.